Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Hey there, this is Rhombus Ticks. Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Every other week we're going to be doing Grenademan versus the zombies, or every other week we're going to be doing some kind of a story. So we're just chugging along now that we've fixed things more or less. This week I'm reading Chapter 10 of Grenademan versus the Zombies by T.C. Ricks. We're breaking up into two parts. Here's part 1. The walls went up in 72 hours. Doc had advanced scouts equipped with motorcycles and satellite phones on the watch for zombies in every town for 100 miles. When they showed up, the town had about 3 days warning. It wasn't so much that the zombies were slow, it was just that they were taking their time. After a while, Doc began to think it was more insidious than that. Momo and the rest of the inner circle had a large number of industrial cement mixers and cranes. The wire mesh reinforcement was in place. The first day involved pouring the foundation. Everyone in town dug a ditch that would hold the foundations in place. Then they all worked with mixers and other elements to put a ring 30 feet tall, 6 feet thick, and 2/3 of a mile long. The first 24 hours had involved setting the foundation. After that, the town worked like ants mixing water, cement, rebar, and calcium chloride, which was used to speed the hardening. Kevin said they'd broken a world record. It was a shame that there was no one to record it. The scaffolding was still there, but everyone relaxed for a solid day afterwards. Most people working on the thing had only had 6 hours of sleep in the previous 2 days, so a bit of celebration was called for. Of course, the hardcore people were working to remove the non-necessary foundation and dig a moat around the town. Armed patrols had begun going out at night, escorting people who were still bringing materials into the siege zone. On the 4th day, reports were finally starting to come in on the news. However, there were also stranger rumors on the internet that there might be some kind of infection that people could get merely from listening to the radio. And as a precaution, people stopped watching television and even stopped using the internet unless absolutely necessary. There was much World of Warcraft withdrawal. Of course, there was also pizza withdrawal, peanut butter withdrawal, perm withdrawal, consistent hot water withdrawal, and half a dozen other little pains that the town had to endure in order to stay solvent. It wasn't so much that these things weren't available, it was just that they became really rare. No one had time for them. They were far too busy just trying to stay alive. Doc was expected to be in half a dozen places at once, but he didn't complain. For once, he and Momo worked together. Doc's amiable people skills and Momo's bureaucratic skills helped to bridge each other's gaps. A lot of preparations had to be taken into consideration, and some of them were actually working. Some of them weren't, of course. Kevin still complained about the safety switches on his traps, but Doc could plainly see that with people running around the way they were, a lot of lives would have been lost if they hadn't put the switches in place. On the first day, they put floodlights around the perimeter and inside the town so they could see what was going on. On the second day, they put the moat in place. On the third day, they created raised barbicans and fortified positions to enhance the wall. By the time the 4th day had rolled around, things were moving rather smoothly. Everyone had an hour shift and usually had 1 or 2 jobs that they were supposed to be doing. By the 5th day, they had secured the animal pins, and by the end of the 6th day, the scaffolding was removed. Everyone was in the town, and things had settled down more or less to a normal routine. And then there was nothing to do but wait. The gasoline had run out for the digging equipment, so by the time they had dug a second moat around the town, there wasn't much to be done. The moats weren't perfect, since a few concrete sewer lines jutted out across them. Momo wasn't going to let them screw up the sewer system just so they could have a perfect moat. Incoming traffic stopped on the 7th day. A few whispered rumors went around that New York, Washington, D.C., Birmingham, and all of New Hampshire had been declared total losses. But at the same time, other rumors were circulating about a second type of zombie, one that could do something to you just by talking to you. Anyone caught watching the news or using the internet was considered suspect. It finally got so bad that by the 8th day, Momo initiated quarantine on anyone who came into contact with hostile information. Doc wasn't too happy about that, but when he actually caught someone walking into town that had a certain look about them, they realized it was the real deal. Despite all of their training, no one could bring themselves to shoot the zombie. The guy looked and acted almost human. They could have had a full-on conversation with the thing. For a while, people thought that this person might have simply been mentally challenged. but they had a few trained psychologists in the town who disagreed. The person was clearly something else. However, they found out that people who had listened to the zombie didn't become infected. Eventually, Doc volunteered to listen to a few radio broadcasts, and it turned out that only 30 to 50% of the population seemed to be affected by the idea of zombies. Books suddenly became a lot more popular, especially books written a long time ago. Fantasy and science fiction were in particular demand, and a thriving underground economy sprung up where people used books as currency. Of course, given that most of them were originally science fiction fans, this wasn't surprising. Horror, for some inexplicable reason, was not in demand, except with a few people who saw it as research to help them fight the zombies. No one had seen any of the normal zombies yet, and that had people on edge. Now that they were listening to the radio, they heard reports and cries for help as close to 40 miles away, but the zombies were clearly making a wide swath around the town. After the first 3 days, most of the sentries had come back to town. No one wanted to be alone out there. At first, people believed it was because they were wise in choosing such an out-of-the-way place. But as days went on, people began to suspect it was something more. 10 days had come and gone, and so far, there had been no sign of the zombies. They knew it couldn't last. Grenademan and Oscar sat watching soldiers walk back and forth along the fence from their vantage point. They were waiting for word of the zombie outbreak to hit so they could initiate an attack. Oscar had set them up in style with 2 lawn chairs near a hotel vista. The rat hole served as a glorified whorehouse that in fact faced the base from the Cuban side of the border. Grenademan simply sat on the edge, but Oscar was fully reclined and relaxed as if he didn't have a care in the world. Guantanamo Camp Z was new. The military had contracted out a few subcontractors, even though it was on U.S. military land. The government used it to store everyone who knew anything about Grenademan or had caused too much unrest with the zombie situation. I still think we should bust my mercenaries out of prison so they can help us here. Oscar spit on the sand and took a sip of his margarita. I don't think that's a good idea, Citizen Oscar. Breaking lawbreakers out of jail to help break a legitimate warrior of the forces of good out of prison seems inefficient. Oscar rolled his eyes a bit, but bit his tongue. Look, I told you I was grateful to you for getting me out of prison. That hellhole, but that doesn't mean I think we can do this alone. Those are trained U.S. Army personnel out there, and we can't just lob a couple of grenades and hope we're going to get Marv out that easily. Grenademan nodded solemnly. You have an excellent point, Citizen Oscar. That is why I also think we should use several hives of bees. Oscar sat up and put his mojito on the table, making sure that the umbrella was pointed towards the sun so that the drink would stay cooler. This coming from the guy who didn't want to use explosive grenades on them because some of them might be innocent. What if some of them are allergic to bee stings? Aha! Time for a useful science fact. Did you know that bees are actually more docile than usual when exposed to smoke? Beekeepers use this technique to harvest honey on all the time. Thus, I shall use one of my many smoke grenades to render the bees harmless. Oscar shook his head. Are you Mr. Wizard under that mask or something? And how are the bees going to do us any good if they're harmless? It is impolite to ask a superhero his secret identity, Citizen Oscar. Furthermore, the bees shall be carrying a special sleep pollen. Grenademan pointed his pointy, helmeted head as if he were a genius. Wait, didn't you say you had sleep grenades? I do, citizen. Then why are you using bees to get this pollen on them when you still have to get close enough to use the smoke grenades to make the bees docile enough so they don't hurt any of them? Grenademan was silent for a moment. Then he said, I have not entirely worked that part out yet. Oscar threw up his hands in disgust. He was about to say something when the sound of a gunshot came across the way. Oscar sat up in alarm and used the binoculars. He could see that all of the prisoners were lined up in nice, neat rows in front of one of the fences. They were all blindfolded, and a large number of soldiers were standing around watching the prisoners. One of the prisoners was on the ground, dying or dead. Grenademan asked Oscar, What are they doing? Oscar stood up and put the binocs down. They're killing the prisoners. Forget the plan. We gotta go now. Grenademan nodded. Very well then. Tally-ho! He immediately leaped away from the area where they had been sitting, straight up 100 feet into the air and then into the water. It was a question of going down to the beach, into the water, and then back onto U.S. soil. It theoretically helped avoid landmines. Grenademan had thought it was pointless, but it was Oscar's plan. Once in the water, Grenademan sank about 40 feet and immediately bounded up again, but failed to maintain his balance because of crashing under the waves. Trying to get the water from his nostrils, he landed on his back, slammed into the water with a titanic splash. For a moment, he had had the wind knocked out of him and just bobbed there. Then he heard another gunshot. The echoes of justice sounded through his ears and down into his heart. Some of these people might have been members of the forces of evil, but even members of the forces of evil should not be summarily shot in such a fashion. Occasionally, they might be unfortunately blown to bits in the course of battle, but it was, as a general rule, superheroes did not kill people or let other people kill people. Grenademan got his wind back and began to swim out across the bay. He saw Oscar running towards the boat, though he also saw that the guard at the watchtower had caught sight of both of them and was pointing a heavy-caliber machine gun at him. This must not pass! Torn for a moment about whether to save the prisoners or save Oscar, Grenademan tossed a sleep gas grenade into the middle of the tower. Oscar's jaw nearly hit the floor. Well over 300 yards away, the tiny green plastic gas canister landed with a thud, almost invisible until it made an impact. When the gunner heard the noise, he looked down. With a panic, the gunner leapt out of the 40-foot tower, breaking his leg. He was not affected by the sleep gas, however. Grenademan continued to swim, and Oscar had started the boat. Another one of the guard towers had trained its machine gun on Oscar, still not aware of the greater threat in the water. At this point, Grenademan realized that each of the guard towers was going to be a problem, so he tossed 4 more sleep gas grenades, each in a different respective tower. The wind coming across the bay helped extend the range, but they were still masterful throws. The guards heard the impacts, but most of them did not react in time. Luckily for them, they merely fell asleep inside the tower. Oscar passed Grenademan on the boat, motioning for him to follow. Grenademan got the hint and shot his grapple gun at the back of the boat, following behind as if he were water skiing. One of his explosive grenades came loose in the process, causing a gigantic shockwave about 100 feet behind them. Dead fish bobbed up to the surface of the bay. Oscar reached the end of the camp from the water, grabbed the assault rifle he had hidden in the boat, and charged. A few of the soldiers on the ground and inside the perimeter fence realized that the guards in the towers were asleep, and climbed up into the towers wearing gas masks. They were about to take hold of the machine guns when Grenademan finally finished swimming to the shore. Just as 2 of the towers were about to open fire on Oscar, Grenademan had tossed 2 slick grenades into each tower, causing frictionless gel to spread about, covering everything inside. The soldiers pulled the trigger at once, but couldn't manage to stay upright enough to grab the gun in the meantime. The soldiers were more concerned about getting the goo out of their eyes and off of their faces. Grenademan tossed an explosive grenade in front of Oscar, blowing a hole in the fence. Oscar shouted at the soldiers executing the prisoners. They were only 3 people away from Marv. Oscar opened fire on full auto. He didn't hit anything, but he did cause the soldiers to scatter to the 4 winds. The prisoners were climbing to their feet at this point, many of them working on removing their bonds or blindfolds. Oscar moved forward to Marv and stood him up. He took out a knife to cut the bonds tying to his hands. Marv removed the blindfold. "Oscar?" Oscar nodded and smiled. "Here to spring you." Marv said, "Wait, there are political prisoners here. We have to free them too." "Do you know which?" Marv nodded. "Yeah, I do. It's pretty obvious when you've been here a while. How'd you do this?" "Tally-ho!" Grenademan tossed another 3 sleep gas grenades in the direction of some of the soldiers. 2 fell down unconscious, but another had donned his mask and was charging at Grenademan with a bayonet at the ready. They had learned now that guns simply did not work when they aimed them at him. Oscar grinned sheepishly. "I had a little help." Marv looked on with amazement. "He's real? I thought the government just made him up. I thought I'd been sent here for nothing. I mean, how?" "I stopped asking those questions a long time ago. Most of the answers he gives are gibberish. Let him do the distracting while we get you and your people out of here." He tossed Mark a knife and then proceeded to free about 2/3 of the other prisoners there. A large mob ran out of the hole Grenademan had created and out towards freedom. A few stayed behind to offer their thanks. Mark pointed at one of them and said, "That guy's Johan. He kept me alive while I was here. I owe him my life." Oscar shook his hand. "Pleased to meet you," Johan asked. "You guys have a plan for getting out of here?" Oscar nodded. "Yeah, but first we have to get a boat back to the mainland and head north." Marv smiled. "Then lead the way." And so he did.
Shut up! This has been Rhombus Ticks reading to you from the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. All of these products are Available on Amazon.com and other marketplaces. Copyright 2015 Red Anvil Amalgamated. Sound editing by Grayson Bergmann. Initial bumper by Electro Rock Cardiogram. To fight the forces of evil!